During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, being an informer for the Brits could lead to interrogations, torture and murder by the IRA.
One of the top men in the IRA for interrogating and murdering informers was Freddie Scappaticci.
But Scappaticci was, in fact, an informer himself, one of England's most prized double agents.
We're doing a full recap of Stakeknife on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
Hey Dee, so before we started this recording, I was sitting in a yoga studio waiting for class to start, and I thought, man, this is boring. And you know what I wish I had with me?
What?
I wish I had my phone. I noticed the person next to me had her phone out while she was waiting for class to start, and I kind of peeked over, and you know what she was doing?
What was she doing?
She was on Patreon, and I could see our logo. She was on patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time. And so I asked her, I said, hey, what are you doing on the So Much Crime, So Little Time Patreon? And she said, I just can't wait to get all the bonus content, the episodes that come out early. She loves the outtakes. She says when Dee is like, it's like she's learning to read, and we get we get that recorded. That's her favorite thing. She also says, I don't know who these two people are who make this show, but I just love the feeling of supporting them. And yeah, so patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time.
Jeff, I think you need to wear your So Much Crime, So Little Time t-shirt to your next yoga class. She'll be starstruck.
I will do that.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, just a warning.
Warning.
This episode will have spoilers for Stakeknife. We're going to discuss the whole series.
If you haven't listened to Stakeknife yet, why not? Wasn't our preview enticing enough? We worked really hard on it. Maybe go back and listen to the preview again. It's before this one in your feed.
You'll also find a link for Stakeknife in our show notes. Hey, Dee, let's do a quick reminder of what this show is.
Okay, so this was released in the winter of 2024 to 2025. Its last episode aired at the end of January 2025. Its host is Mark Horgan. It's 10 episodes in total, and all of them are between 45 to an hour long. 45 minutes to an hour long. But remind us, like, what did we hear about? What was the story that we heard about in episode 1?
Yeah, so in episode 1, which we talked about in our preview episode, we heard this press conference from 2003, and that's where this guy, Freddie Scappaticci, came out to deny accusations that were about to be released, basically saying that he was a double agent working for the Brits, and his code name was Stakeknife. That's where the title of the show comes from. So he had been working as a high-ranking IRA official during the Troubles through the early 90s, and his job there was to interrogate and sometimes murder the people who are suspected of being informers. But he was also apparently a top informer for the British government. In that first episode, we also heard from Sylvia Jones. She was a reporter who had interviewed Scappaticci years earlier, but not published the story. So after the press conference in 2003, she dug up her old notes and tapes and published her story, basically to refute his refuting that he was Stakeknife, basically confirming that he was Stakeknife. Then he fled, basically disappeared.
What a way to say it. Refute his refuting. Yeah. Basically confirm.
Yes. He then fled Northern Ireland, basically disappeared, kind of witness protection type situation. And yeah, that was pretty much episode 1. So there were 9 more episodes. A lot of content here. We're not going to go through every little bit, but where would you like to start our discussion?
I don't know. I feel like, you know where I want to start? I want to start at something random and annoying. And I would imagine Mark Horgan, if he heard me starting off our full recap with this, would be like, feck's sake. But did you notice how the BBC were saying if you were in the UK, you'd get early access to episodes? That annoyed me.
Yeah.
That really annoyed me. I was like, really? Like, really? I know this is a BBC Sounds podcast and that's fair, but like, have you listened to it yourself? Should we all not just get equality here? Like,
yeah, that irony was not lost on me. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, this is a thing.
Let's step back from
putting it out there. Okay, step back.
There was a lot of very, I think, powerful emotional content here. A lot of these stories were from before you were born, and
Mm-hmm.
you're from Dublin, not like Belfast or Derry or where some of these stories took place, but not that far away. So I'm curious, like your just overall feeling, like how did this hit home for you?
I think we were so, especially being so young, we were so blinded to all of this. We didn't really see it. Whereas my parents, they saw it in the news. It was kind of more like visceral for them because they were seeing it. It's like an hour and 20 minutes up the road. Like it's not that far away. And
Yeah.
all of this is happening. I feel like the one story in episode 9 about Catherine
Catherine Moreland.
Mulholland? No.
Moreland.
Moreland.
Yeah.
And her daughter Shauna.
Shauna.
That was really stuck because she was so young. 9. Oh yeah. Okay. Episode 9. Because she was so young and she was kind of talking about how she didn't really, it didn't hit her. She didn't know. But then she was also talking about murder and like people might die at the same time. And she was 10. Like she shouldn't be thinking like that. But that was definitely one where I was imagining, like I wasn't 10 in, I think it was 93 that she was talking about. It was 93 her mother was killed.
Her mother was killed in 94, right before the ceasefire. The documentary, I think, was 93. So she was in this German documentary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that really like hit because she was like so young or whatever. And then it had such a profound, obviously, impact on her life. Everything changed. Her saying that was so bizarre. Everything changed for me that day, apart from my GP. My dentist changed, my school changed, my neighbors changed, my bedroom changed. Like she moved to a totally different area. And then she was like, the only reason my GP stayed the same is he was working in 2 practices at the time. Like, I don't know. It just felt the knock-on implications. And that's what we're hearing about throughout this podcast is everyone talks about the informers and like informers or touts having to be like put away with, but they don't talk about the impact that causes and the ripples that causes within the families, within the community itself. And then like her even finding out that her mother's friends were actually culpable in her being taken away and how much that hurt. I don't know. It just was there was so much emotion I felt like in that episode and in that story. And I just thought it was extremely powerful.
That was one of the most powerful stories. I mean, I think there were so many clips from that documentary where she was a little kid and like you'd hear her playing with her friends and there'd be helicopters hovering or gunshots. And, you know, she'd talk about Halloween and how, I think she was talking about Halloween where she'd say like sometimes you hear, I forget the term she used.
Bangers. Yeah. So they're like, you don't have them here. It's kind of like, okay, it's a type of firework, but it's like a small thing and all it does is like blow up. Like it just goes
like a firecracker.
But a firecracker isn't dangerous, is it?
Yeah.
If you held a firecracker. Okay. Well, yeah, okay. That's similar.
Okay. But sometimes she would say it's
Bangers
that. And sometimes
will blow off your fingers. Yeah.
Sometimes it's gunfire. And
yeah. And it's kind of like you don't know which.
That was in episode 9. Then episode 10, you had the story about Paul Wilson, the son of Thomas Emmanuel Wilson, who was killed as an informant. Paul was I think a 10-month-old baby. This is like 1987.
Yeah.
That one I thought.
And it was his aunt. So his dad's sister was the first person to speak on the podcast from a victim's family point of view.
Yeah.
And he was the last person to speak, which was such a nice, like, rounding, like really bringing it all back together.
It did. And I think, that one, coming right at the end about hearing from this guy who basically grew up without his dad, right? Like his dad was gone for really his whole conscious life. And I don't know. And then they kind of retraced where Scappaticci was towards after he went into hiding and kind of following that path. That happened a couple times, right? Because that also happened early on in episode 2 with the Michael and Seamus Carney story. So Michael Carney was killed, and Seamus then went back to the site where his brother was killed in, I think, 1979. which I thought was also, I mean, this is just full of these powerful stories about here a sibling or a child of someone who was killed either directly by Scappaticci or connected to Scappaticci in some way. These kind of like low level informers who were some version of blackmailed or exploited into becoming informers, or weren't informers at all. Not all of them actually were informers. They were just suspected of being informers. But it seemed like the theme was just they were less important than Scappaticci. They were expendable. But then, hearing from their family members, I mean, it just made it so much more, I think, resonant of the impact that each one of these people's deaths had.
Yeah, I really feel like throughout this, one of the strengths of this podcast, I think, is like it's telling a really complicated story, and yet it told it in a linear fashion. Like it was kind of bringing you throughout history, and then I know it circled around at the end, but I felt like it was much easier to follow along with than some other podcasts we've listened to that are spanning over, decades. And I thought that was, from a listener's point of view, it was really the right way to tell this. There was a lot of hopping around. There's a lot of names being thrown around, and that linear fashion, I think, really allowed it all to flow in a way that you weren't focusing on trying to follow the story. You were focused on like feeling the story, because it was so powerful. It was so emotive. Like each episode I kept thinking, this is my favorite episode. This story is the one that's getting me. But I think it was because I was so immersed in it. I said to you right before we started recording, I don't remember the last time I've listened to a 10 episode podcast on ×1 speed.
Yeah.
And I didn't listen to it while doing something else. I might have been doing something else, but it wasn't a case that my mind is traveling. Like my mind is focused on this at all times when I was listening to it. And I don't know, Jeff, was that because of my connection here? Like because the troubles were something that I'd heard about? Like from your point of view, was that similar?
Yeah. The more I listened to it, the more I found myself making sure I was listening to it at a time where I could really focus on it. So other ones we've listened to, I would listen to, while I'm driving or while I'm like different activities where I'm like only kind of not, 75% engaged with it, or I'm kind of going in and out. And with this one, I found like I was queuing up episodes and like pausing them to listen to something else where I'd normally be listening to this, just because I wanted to make sure I could really give it my attention. I think you're right. I think to me, it struck me that I didn't even think of this in terms of a linear story. I guess I didn't really think about how linear it was. I was thinking more just about how each episode in and of itself was like a contained story. They all connected and they all overlapped. And when you step back from it, you get this whole story of Scappaticci's role in this, even though he's basically never in it. And we're more just hearing about him from people who are connected to him. But he's in every episode in a way. But it's really just more about these other people who were affected. But each story, each episode was a contained story. Like each episode could have been expanded into its own podcast, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like anyone could pick up one of these episodes, know a little bit of a background and get something from it. They might not get everything from it, but they'd get something from it. On that note, I'd love to come back to something we spoke about in episode 1, which was one of the criticisms. What we had was the lack of context for someone who wouldn't know. So things like the blanket protest is mentioned, the H Block, the Maze Prison, Gerry Adams is mentioned. I know they bring up Martin McGuinness again. They're talking about Sinn Féin. I was just wondering how lacking in context. Like, did you feel like you needed to pause and Google in order to really get an idea for what they're talking about?
I kind of, yes and no. I don't think you have to. Like, I think it's true that it continued throughout where there wasn't context for a lot of things. And there were some things I'm sure you appreciated on a deeper level than I did that I did not look up because I just like it went by too fast and I didn't catch what it was, and I didn't understand the significance of it, or I didn't understand like the context. There were some things I did look up, and then I found myself this happened multiple times where I'd start looking something up that was mentioned in this, and then I'd realize, oh, but now I'm missing what I'm listening to, so I have to pause it to really focus on reading about it, because some of these things were complicated. And I mean, it's just
Of course. Most of it is.
well, even just like the terminology that was used for like within the IRA, the different units of the like British intelligence and military, and like both sides had a lot of complexity to it. And I eventually was like, I'm getting context clues. I'm getting a lot of this, but I'm sure different people are going to get wildly different levels of things from this. And I'm more on this, probably on the surface, much more on the surface level than you might be. There were some really interesting things that I did look up that I wanted to talk more about. For example, the Boston College project. Had you heard of that before?
No.
Okay.
It really was only just like a smattering in I think it was episode 2 or 3.
It was early. Maybe. I have it in my notes in episode 5, but I think it might have maybe it was brought up before that.
It was brought up before that, yeah.
In 5, we hear from Anthony McIntyre, and it's mentioned how he had some involvement in this project, but it's not really like I feel like it's more just kind of like a throwaway reference, but that just caught my ear as like that sounded interesting. And then I went down a pretty big rabbit hole on that project. Well, okay. You're
like, ooh, an American side to this that I can feel connected to.
I have a connection to Boston College.
I know. I am semi.
My nephew is there right now. My dad went there. But I went on the subreddit for Ask Historians, and there was a post from someone called A Dissident Is Here that is very long, and I will not read it to you. But basically, the gist of it is, this project was horribly run. And so, okay, just context if you don't remember what this how this was brought up. So this was a research project that came about a few years after the peace agreements. So it was like the early 2000s, and the idea was that people who were involved in the IRA could tell their stories, create an oral history. It would be anonymized, and it would be kept secret until they were dead. That was the deal. You'll share your experience, your involvement, what you did, but it will not come out until you're dead. And then it got caught up in the courts. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court because I think it was I don't know all the details, but basically the British were trying to prosecute people, and they realized that this was testimony that they could potentially use. And Boston College effectively caved. I think Boston College came out of this looking real bad, like from a ethics and research study standpoint. But so a lot of this stuff came out, and I mean, there's a whole podcast in this story, I think. Yeah, I don't know. It was just an interesting thing that these people were willing to talk. These people who had, I think, knew the risks, were willing to go kind of on the record as long as it wouldn't be released until after they were dead. And then within a handful of years, it seemed like it was just going to come out, all of it.
It's kind of wild, isn't it? Like that, because I can understand someone saying, especially like if their life is so different now than it was, like going through the troubles, and someone saying like, people should know this story, but I don't want it to be lost, but I don't want it to be out while I'm still alive. The other side to that is like, were they ever thinking of, their families and maybe the ripples or the knock-on implications on their families? I don't know.
Well, that was the thing about, so a different angle, the Shauna Moreland thing from episode 9, where it sounds like she was the first family member of someone who had been killed as an informer to kind of come forward and say, hey, like, we, like, this, what happened was wrong, and want to bring attention to this and want to be an advocate. But I'm sure a lot of family members, whether they were ashamed or afraid or like for lots of reasons, didn't like she showed a significant amount of bravery, I think, to come forward and kind of put her name and her face out there to talk about this. I mean, I guess she did too when she was 10 years old and she went in this documentary.
I mean, I wonder, is it because she didn't know for so long that her mother was apparently an informer. She believed it was like a case of mistaken identity. And I wonder, like, in comparison to, say, episode 6, when we're hearing about playing God in the Bogside, we're in Derry with Kevin Coyle.
Yeah.
Kevin Coyle Jr. And he is speaking about the PTSD, the like living as an 8-year-old and someone's dad telling them to beat him up because, like, telling his son to beat Kevin Coyle up because his dad was a tout. Like, he lived with it and he felt that. Like, I wonder, and everyone has their own part to play depending on like what your journey is and like what you've seen. But Shauna didn't have to live through that. Not to minimize at all what she lived through, but for him it might have been much harder because he was already seen for so long and made feel for so long. Like, he was to blame. Like, his father was the worst because of it, where she didn't have that because she had moved. For however it played out, that she just got shielded from it.
Yeah. Well,
whereas Kevin Coyle didn't have that.
Kevin Coyle,
and I kind of
also
wonder his sister.
Yeah, that episode also had his sister Orla, who basically went to Scotland because she said if she stayed, they were in Derry, and she said that if she was in Derry, like, it was just too much. Like, she couldn't mentally handle it, and that, like, it saved her life, like, leaving the country.
And it nearly killed him staying. Yeah,
which I think that episode, I think, really resonated for me, just of how, like, the impact it had. I mean, they were children, right? Like, Kevin Coyle had 3 kids with a 4th on the way. His wife was pregnant, and this was in 1985. Yeah, I mean, you think about that, like, generational impact that had.
I'm laughing at my notes for episode 6, where it's like, this may have been my favorite episode. And then, like, as I said, as we went down, like, every episode, like, really got me. I really liked how that episode in particular, though, was produced. And I don't know whether it's because I really like Derry as a city. I've been there. I've done these amazing tours that they have there that really make you feel like you're just hearing it from a primary source. A lot of the tour guides, like, lived through the Troubles, and so we're able to, like, give you these references. And I felt we were wandering around the city. We could hear the heavy breathing. We're hearing news clips about the murders from different places. And I don't know if you caught this, but, you know, it was like, so-and-so is killed in Derry. And then there's like an English broadcast saying so-and-so is killed in Londonderry, which is like...
I missed that.
You know.
That's what they call it. That's the British name for it.
Yeah, basically, if you're Irish or Republican, you will always call it Derry. But if you are British, it's Londonderry. Like,
they just threw London on the front of it. That's like the laziest. There's a Londonderry in New Hampshire. Oh, that's where it comes from. Okay. Wait, I'm sorry. You said you went on tours of Derry. What do you see on a tour? Like, what types of things are you looking at?
You go on, like, the wall of the city, and, like, basically they show you how then and basically still now, like, this, like, it's split in half. Like, one side is unionists and they've their painted curbs in the Union Jack colours, and then the other side of the city is like tricolour everywhere, and like they're the Republicans. And then they bring you around the murals that are like painted in different parts of the city. It's similar enough to in Belfast. That's the same thing. You can do like a black taxi tour in Belfast, where you literally get into a black taxi and this person will drive you around different murals in different parts of the city, explaining like the story of the Troubles and just the history of the city in general.
That sounds fascinating. Yeah,
I loved going to both of those places. But have you seen the mural in Derry that like you are now entering free Derry?
No? I don't think so. What's this in
if
Derry
you look
Girls?
Up the Bogside, it is definitely features in Derry Girls. If you look up the Bogside murals, you're gonna see some of them. And like if you look up the signs, like if you've put Londonderry name into or Derry into search, you'll see English signs. So Irish signs have the Irish name on top, like Oscuelga, and then the like English translation underneath, and you'll see Derry and Derry, but the English signs only have the English name, and it'll always be Londonderry. And people like, I'm googling it here, and the first few that come up, like London is scribbled out at the front of it.
I see some of
like
that.
This still is like a thing, obviously. So I just think, I feel like because I felt like I was there in that episode with the heavy breathing, with the wandering around the city, the news clips, like Kevin Coyle and his sister Orla being so emotional and so open and vulnerable about the trauma they suffered as a result of all of this. And I just thought it was so very well produced. I thought the whole thing was so very well produced, but that one in particular I thought was excellent.
You know, it's interesting. We've been talking about this now for a bit, and we really haven't talked about Scappaticci. Like we talked about these family members of these victims of his crimes, and which I think speaks to the way the podcast was put together, because the focus really, like his code name is the name of the show, but it's not really about him necessarily. Like he's almost just like this shadow that permeates it, but he's not the central focus. He's not the central focus,
but he is the central theme. Like he's the theme that runs everything together here. And I agree. I think it's the marker of such a great, well-produced podcast to have told the story of Stakeknife without talking about him too much. And even when they were speaking about him, it was never, I don't think it was necessarily harsh. I don't think it was necessarily like upping him and like bigging him up as a person. I felt like it was just the facts of it and the impact of it.
I think that's an interesting
point.
Or of him. What little we know about him, we don't know a lot about him, but we get a couple of glimmers of things that are real bad. Like how he potentially became this double agent in the first place involved possibly some sort of sex crime, but we don't really know. We don't really know. I don't think we can even say that, because I think that's kind of thrown out there at it, like throughout, and then at the end as well, because of the pornographic material found on his computer when he eventually was caught, brought in for questioning and let off because of like good behavior or something, or like a good record. I think what isn't explicitly said, I don't feel like this is explicitly said, but I think what is implicit throughout this is we hear so much about these people like Catherine Moreland who were put in these sort of impossible situations where they were essentially had to become informers. I mean, the same thing with, what's his name? Joe Fenton. And I mean, feel like all of these stories about where we got to hear how they became informers was their children were going to be taken away. They were facing decades in prison. They were stuck. They were forced into this. And I think it's alluded to that was probably the case. I mean, that's kind of why else would you become an informer, right? Like we didn't hear about anyone who did it because they secretly loved England and hated Ireland, right? Like that wasn't in this podcast. But I feel like there's an implication that Scappaticci was just the one with the most power. And it's not that he was ruthlessly killing people because they were lower level than him or because they were going to expose him. It does seem like he was killing people sometimes because they were going to expose him, but it wasn't presented with sort of moral condemnation. I think you're right. Like it was presented as here are the sort of facts.
I don't even feel like that's necessarily factual. Like, yes, he was maybe trying to cover up for himself, but his agent, his handler, was trying to cover up for himself because these other people were expendable and he was not. So
no, I don't.
How much of that was them saying you need to get rid of? Because like if you look at episode 7 when 7 and 8 when he stitches up Danny Morrison and basically gets Danny Morrison, who was like Sinn Féin's director of communication or publicity or something, he gets him caught in a house with someone who has just been interrogated with was it Sandy Lynch. So Danny Morrison then goes away, was put in for 8 years, got out after 5, and then the whole thing was squashed later. But I don't think Scappaticci necessarily was trying to put them away. I think he was told, we need to get someone at the top. And Danny Morrison was that someone. So how much of the decisions throughout were Scappaticci versus how much were his handler being like, we cannot do without you?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And in that episode 8, the one about largely about Danny Morrison, there was that exchange with this Ian Hurst, who was the one who called the general, the army general, pretending to be a reporter.
Can we take a moment for Ian Hurst?
It's fascinating.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Very paranoid man, but like fascinating.
He records everybody.
We hear him in episode 3, and then we hear him again, I think, in episode 8.
Yeah.
And like, this man's just ringing people up, lying about who he is. When the police come in to question him, he's like recording them as they're doing it.
Of course he is. There's an exchange that we heard in episode 8 where he's talking to the general. He's pretending to be a reporter, and I think he's trying to get the general just to admit to whatever he can get the general to admit to. And Ian says, so if you're doing it on behalf of the state, there is no crime. So he's asking that as a question. So basically, like, if the story behind that question is like, are you kind of culpable, responsible legally for murder? And the general basically says you balance the good with the bad, and that he felt he was confident what they were doing was legal, basically sacrificing their own informers, their lower level informers, to protect their higher level informer. And I mean, like, they force these people into becoming informers, and then they know that they're going to get killed, and they just let it happen.
I'm just hanging someone out to dry, hoping the IRA would kill them.
Yeah.
And like, from an English point of view, and we get a little bit of this, we get as much as we could throughout this podcast, I feel like. But is it a case of, well, one less IRA man, one less terrorist, out there?
Is it?
So,
I mean,
what does it matter?
In a way, they put the time and energy into getting these people to become agents for them, to become informers for them. And I mean, the situations we hear about are situations where they had to make a choice between who was more expendable. And the answer is always the one below Scappaticci is more expendable. And that's the focus of the story. And I'm sure there's other situations. And we did hear about one. I mean, that was the case with Sandy Lynch, where they did decide to come in and save him, right? Like, they decided that he was worth rescuing.
That's not what I got from the Sandy Lynch one at all. What I got is they wanted Danny Morrison. Sandy Lynch wasn't the target there from a British point of view. Danny Morrison was the target.
Right, but they rescued, like, Sandy Lynch was going to be killed. And the Brits came in and saved him because he was because he had value to them still.
I just feel like that's not, I don't feel like that's an accurate. Well, I don't know. Maybe we just took two different things, because like, from my point of view, what Sandy Lynch was expendable, but you couldn't get Danny Morrison unless you got Sandy Lynch alive.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
So Sandy Lynch was the step to getting Danny Morrison.
Yeah. Therefore,
but it
Sandy
ended up being, interestingly enough, the end of Scappaticci from an English point of view.
Right. That's funny. That was episode 7 and 8, and that was definitely where I got a little lost in who everyone was. That was a little harder to follow for me. What did you think? Let me ask you this. So that was also a point in episode 7 where we heard from Lynch's kind of account of what it was like to be interrogated by the IRA, like what that experience was like. And we heard about several people basically, like, we knew they were interrogated for, X number of days. And there was another episode earlier on where we heard about that house where the guy was like watching like the Mike Tyson fight and
House of Horrors.
Yeah. And was that Joe Fenton was being interrogated? I don't remember.
Yeah, the real estate guy. Yeah, we talked about that in our preview episode, just about like the tactics. And how did you feel about how that was handled? As in, do I feel like it was too visceral and too gruesome.
Yeah.
I don't think they leaned into it. I don't feel like we heard about it was, I suppose, as Scappaticci had said when we spoke about it in our preview, it was a mental game. There seemed to be a lot of mental torture. I'm trying to remember which
Joe Fenton was
woman,
physical torture. We heard about that.
We did hear about Joe Fenton, and that was mirroring off the Tyson fight. You're right. I don't know. I suppose with Joe Fenton, like obviously it was like horrendous, and you're hearing like the beating and the blah 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 and the this and the other. But did we get gruesome details?
No, I don't think we did. I actually think, I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking back to one of our recent episodes where we were talking about Dateline and kind of Dateline's more salacious style. I feel like this was the polar opposite of that. This was, I thought, much more kind of tactful and not salacious. I don't know the antonym of salacious. Tasteful. Respectful.
It was more journalistic. It was more like we're telling a story. We're not trying to like detail.
Journalistic. And we haven't really talked about this, but also I feel like this whole series was just artful.
Yeah.
Like it was atmospheric. It was like it used silence well. It used music well. Like it was well produced. And it was like it was understated.
It used to like I liked like the clips of like, oh hey, like I'm just gonna put your mic on here and like say your name, count to 10, like in the background nearly as they're setting up this atmosphere and then like launching in. I felt like it was just all produced so well. Like
how often does
without
Mark
listening
Horgan,
to the story, it felt like that.
Yeah. Mark Horgan, so many times we hear him asking if it's okay if he clips a microphone on someone.
Yeah.
He's so incredibly polite.
Even, was it when they're in the Bogside and he said all the kids were like, what are you recording? And he was like, it's audio only. There's no camera. It's for a podcast. And all the little kids are like running up to him and stuff. I don't know. He just seemed, incredibly polite, and he never seemed to be, he was dealing with people with very raw, like very deep emotions about possibly the hardest times in their lives, and it never felt like he was trying to get a bit from them. It never felt like he was digging to, to exploit. It felt like he was on the journey with them, and he was trying to allow them a chance to be open and honest and vulnerable in a respectful way to tell their story.
I think it came out, he mentioned, I don't know if he mentioned this definitely at the end, where he talked about how this was 3 years. This was a 3-year project for him and his team. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I don't know, I feel like we don't always know how long people are working on these stories that we listen to, but it definitely seems right that this was something that he didn't just kind of like throw this together. Like this was a multi-year investment, and he put a significant amount of time into it. And it wasn't just him, right? Like this was a whole group of people making this happen. Yeah, I feel like this was definitely at the top end of the like well-made, well-researched, highly like has a lot of integrity podcast that we've listened to.
It might be my favorite podcast I have ever listened to.
Wow, that's a big claim.
Yeah, I know. I loved it. Like, I will be listening again.
Yeah.
And how did you feel at the end when, like, at the end of the day, even when he died, Scappaticci, it was like hidden for a bit to make sure that it's like better for him. And there is no resolve. Like, some people don't get the final say of like who murdered, or get to find out like who murdered their father or mother or brother or grandfather or whatever.
Well, and first of all, do you think he's really dead?
Yeah.
100%.
I mean, he was 70 odd. Not that that's old. Sorry.
I was going to say that's not that old.
I don't know that like there is a benefit to, well, I suppose the benefit to him having been dead would be the investigation closes, which I found fascinating. Like, they couldn't do more of the investigation because he was dead.
That doesn't track for me.
That doesn't track. That's not the same for like other cases.
I appreciate that this wasn't presented as like a more salacious podcast would play up the drama in this, is he dead or isn't he dead, more than this did. In a way, I almost like got to the end of this and thought, it doesn't really matter. These families are never really going to get the resolution whether he's alive or not.
No.
It's just too intractable.
Well, they don't have the upper hand.
Yeah. You're still fighting, the British intelligence and British military, and they're never going to play along.
I feel like with the whole podcast, like it brings up like things that I had kind of said to you before, like how a story is told, like the perspective it's told from impacts how people feel. So when we were speaking about this, I think off mic about episode 1, I was saying, at the time, the IRA were called terrorists by people who were not Republicans, who were not in Ireland. People in Europe thought they were terrorists. People all over a lot of places in the world thought they were terrorists. What they were doing was no different than what the British Army were doing. But what they were much smaller. And I couldn't help but feel, if we bring this to a very basic stage where it's a bully, the bigger person in the yard, who for all of the year or 8 years of school is picking on the smaller person, and finally the smaller person stands up to the bigger person, they are still not equal. They're not equal in size, in magnitude, in confidence, in whatever. But are they both seen as being the same? Is if the smaller person starts to use different tactics to get the bigger person, like it just felt to me like, I don't think I'm saying this right, but it just felt to me like, in my mind, what I was always taught, what I always grew up with, was they were fighting for what they believed in and for what was rightfully theirs. Like that was what we grew up with. And that was the IRA. We didn't believe that the violence was right, but like they were. And then from a British point of view, they are terrorists disrupting the peace. But the British were disrupting the peace. They had disrupted the peace for 800 years.
Right.
They were continuing to disrupt the peace for their benefit. And it just felt to me like, I know in episode 4, sorry, now I'm going on a bit of a rant, but on episode 4, there was the taxi driver, McElmurray, who was murdered because he was a potential informant. And apparently he absolutely wasn't. But anyway, the priest at his funeral was commenting on the connection between the IRA and the mafia and MI5 and the CIA and the British intelligence. They're all doing the same thing. Some are legitimized, like the British were legitimized because they were run by the government, but nobody saw the IRA as a legitimate like organization or government. They were seen as terrorists. And I'm like when the British do this, when the Americans do this, when the Russians do it, people are like, I don't know, it's all okay. But when it's just something that came to mind. It's sad because so many countries, like this is happening all of the time.
It's happening all.
What was sad, I think, is that the people that were brought into this didn't ask for it. They didn't want to be involved in it in a lot of times, in a lot of cases. And that's what was so sad during the Troubles. It's like, it was just your average Joe. It was your taxi driver, your barman, your real estate agent. They had something. They were got by one side, they were got by the other, and they were discarded when they were no longer needed.
Yeah, and it's true. And I think it's messy. And Russia's an interesting example. I mean, there are examples of this right now in a lot of different places, but it's interesting. I was reading an article a week or two ago about the use by the Ukraine of drones, and how they've kind of weaponized these commercially available drones, and how it's become, I guess it's a thing on social media to watch the footage, like the camera of these drones basically hunting Russian soldiers, and how they, they developed all these tactics for blowing up tanks, and there's a way of looking at that these Russian soldiers are largely conscripted into this. They didn't choose to go fight. They're being forced to go in and fight. But also, they're invading a country that isn't theirs, and they're murdering civilians. And I mean, they are the British in this metaphor, right? It's not a one-to-one metaphor, but in a way, they have invaded a country that isn't theirs, and they are raping and pillaging. And the other side is fighting back. And some of their fighting back includes hurting Russian civilians, right? Like they're sending weapons into Russia, and sometimes there are non-military casualties. I don't see that as wrong. Really, like I don't feel great about it, but I want Ukraine to win this war. Like I want them to get the Russians out, and anything it takes, which I feel like is the IRA mentality of, I'm sure there's a lot of conflicted feelings about the civilians who got caught up in this, but there's a bigger point here. There's a bigger war here, and people get hurt, and bad things happen in a war. So and you're right, though. I mean,
what was the line? When there are no rules, people make them up for themselves.
Yeah.
I felt like there was, and maybe that was the interesting thing about episode 9 as well, is that there was a line. Catherine Moreland was apparently the line. People, apparently numerous, it took them so long to find someone who would actually kill her because so many people said no. Like, we're coming up onto a ceasefire. She is a single mother of 3 kids.
That was, I thought, a really interesting point, because that showed the humanity of the people in the IRA.
Mm-hmm.
That there were so many people unwilling to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that was a really humanizing moment of, these aren't just terrorists. These aren't ruthless killers. These are real people with empathy.
Powerful.
Yeah.
It's one I will definitely come back to.
I appreciate you bringing this one to us to talk about. This was an exceptional
big
podcast.
Shout out to my brother, who was like, people should listen to this. My husband had just mentioned it to me, and I was like, yeah, we should get on this. This is it was far better than I thought it was going to be. It was excellent.
Highly recommend.
High recommend. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. Before you get to hear a snippet about what we're going to listen to next, don't forget to leave us a comment on Instagram, send us an email, or rate us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to spread the word. We love seeing new listeners come. We love hearing from our listeners, and we really appreciate all your support. Thank you.
All right, Dee, so next time, let me tell you a little story. January night, 1978. A white light burns across the sky. It's Cosmos 954, which is a nuclear-powered Soviet spy satellite that malfunctioned and was crashing back to Earth. As it disintegrated in the atmosphere, it spread dangerous radioactive debris. If this happened in London or New York, it would have been a huge story. But this happened in the Northwest Territories of Canada, which was the traditional lands of the Dene people and other indigenous peoples of that area. So the story got buried. But we're going to listen to a podcast about this. It's called Operation Morning Light. That's next time on So Much Crime.
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.